Earth went dark across the galaxy. Then its most dangerous warship sent one final signal. The signal towers on Threll Station had never gone silent before, not once in 40 years. The station sat at the edge of the Cavarin Reach, a lonely outpost built from 3 broken asteroids and a lot of patched metal, and its only real job was to listen. It listened to the trade lanes, the diplomatic channels, the endless chatter of 1,000 species talking over each other in 1,000 languages, and somewhere in that noise, every single day, there had always been a small, steady thread of human traffic. Cargo manifests, weather reports from colony worlds. Music sometimes, drifting out on open frequencies because humans like to share things even when nobody asked them to. Today there was nothing. Station Chief Ael Dorun noticed it first. The way anyone notices a sound has stopped only after it stops. She sat in her chair, with 6 limbs curled around a control console shaped for her body, her lower set of eyes still half asleep in the low morning light, and something felt wrong before she even understood why. She flicked through the frequency logs. Nothing. She checked the beacon at Corward Junction, the one relay everyone trusted because Earth's engineers had built it, and human engineers did not build things that failed. The beacon was dead. Not damaged, not jammed, dead, the way a candle is dead after you blow it out. Run a diagnostic, she told her assistant, a thin, nervous being named Foss, who had joined the station only 6 months earlier. Foss ran it twice. Both times the answer came back the same. The relay was intact. Power was flowing. The problem was not the machine. The problem was that no signal was arriving to be relayed. Every human transmission in known space had stopped at the same moment. 3 days later, the Galactic Concord Assembly convened an emergency session, and for the first time in over a decade, every seat in the chamber was filled. The assembly hall was a vast dome, built to comfortable indifference to any one species' sense of scale, with floating platforms arranged in slow orbits so that delegates from worlds with heavy gravity, low gravity, or no real concept of up at all, could all attend in comfort. Usually the hall was half empty during routine sessions. Today the murmur of 200 different languages, filtered and translated through the Concord's implant network, filled the space like a rising tide. At the center platform stood Ambassador Yeshel Korin, a Tassari diplomat with pale blue skin, and the calm, patient face of someone who had spent 30 years learning how to make angry species sit down and talk instead of fight. She had also spent the last 11 years as the Concord's primary liaison to the human worlds, and she looked, for the first time that most delegates could remember, genuinely rattled. At 0400 Concord Standard, 3 days ago, she said, her voice carried by amplifiers to every corner of the dome. All signal traffic originating from human space ceased. Every relay station along the border stopped receiving transmissions. Every trade convoy scheduled to depart human territory failed to arrive. Every diplomatic channel to Earth, to Mars, to the Centauri colonies, to every human outpost we have contact with, has gone silent. A low ripple of sound moved through the chamber. Delegates leaned toward each other, translators murmuring, mandibles clicking, vocal sacs inflating and deflating, in species-specific expressions of alarm. "Is this a technical failure?" asked Delegate Vren of the Karsu Combine, a squat armored being whose species had fought 2 wars against Earth's fleet a generation ago, and lost both badly. There was something almost hopeful in the way he asked it, and several delegates noticed. "We do not believe so," Yeshel said. "The failure is too complete, too simultaneous, and too clean. A technical fault would leave traces, damaged infrastructure, partial signals, errors in the system logs. We are seeing none of that. Every relay reports the same thing Threll Station reported. The equipment works perfectly. There is simply nothing coming through." "Then it is deliberate," said a new voice. Admiral Tovek Rel, of the Concord Joint Fleet, stood near the back of the platform. His 4 eyes narrowed in the way his species showed concentration. He was an old soldier, one of the few non-humans who had actually served alongside human forces during the Skarn incursion 15 years earlier, and when he spoke, most of the room quieted to listen. Humans do not lose their entire communications network by accident. I have seen their engineers work. Their redundancy systems alone would take a coordinated, sustained effort to defeat. This was not an accident. Someone did this, or humanity did this to itself. Why would they cut themselves off from the entire galaxy? Vren asked, his tone suggesting he already suspected an answer he liked. I do not know, Tovek said, but I know what it means when a species with humanity's history goes quiet on purpose. It means they do not want anyone watching what they do next. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence, and in that silence, an image appeared on the great display above the central platform, called up by the Assembly's own historical archive at Yeshel's request. It showed a warship. Long, dark, built with none of the graceful curves most spacefaring cultures favored, all sharp angles and blunt armor plating. Its hull marked with a name most of the room recognized on sight, even those who had never seen a human ship in person. UES Kestrel's Requiem. Beneath the image, the archive displayed a single line of data. Last known position, classified. Last contact, 71 hours ago. That, Tovek said quietly, is the ship humans call the Widowmaker. She was in orbit above a border colony called New Providence when the blackout began, and she has not reported in since. To understand why 200 alien delegates went quiet at the sight of a single warship, one had to understand what humanity had done to earn that silence, and Ambassador Yeshel Koren, sensing the mood of the room, decided this was the moment to explain it properly, for the benefit of the newer delegates who had not yet lived through the years she had. 43 years earlier, a human survey ship had drifted into a system on the edge of Concord space, its crew half-starved and half-frozen, having limped there on a damaged engine after their homeworld's first attempt at long-range travel nearly killed them all. First contact protocols were followed. The humans were welcomed, cautiously, the way the Concord welcomed all new species, with polite distance, careful observation, and quiet assumptions about where this fragile single-world civilization would eventually rank in the galactic order. Humanity was, by every measure the Concord used, supposed to be unremarkable. A single homeworld, no prior contact with alien life, technology roughly 3 centuries behind the Concord average. Every projection said humans would spend the next 200 years as a minor client species, grateful for Concord protection, useful mainly for their strange creativity, and their apparently bottomless capacity for hard physical labor in environments other species found unbearable. The projections were wrong within a decade. It was not that humans were smarter than everyone else. Species across the galaxy had genius among their numbers. It was not that they had better technology, not at first. It was something harder to put in a report. Humans treated every problem as something that could be solved if you simply refused to stop trying. They built ships that should not have worked, using materials other species had abandoned as inefficient, because a human engineer had looked at an old design and thought, quietly, this is stupid, we can do this better, and then simply done it. They took jobs no one else wanted, the deep mining, the radiation-heavy industrial work, the void-diving salvage runs that killed a dangerous number of workers from every other species that attempted them. And they did those jobs well, because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history doing dangerous things and surviving anyway. And then came the Skarn incursion. The Skarn were not part of the Concord. They lived beyond its borders, in the cold dark between star clusters, and they had one simple belief about every civilization they encountered. It existed to be harvested, not conquered. Harvested. Populations reduced to labor stock, worlds stripped of resources, cultures erased because culture served no purpose to a Skarn hive mind that valued only production and expansion. They had done this to 11 known civilizations before they found the Concord's border, and the Concord, for all its diplomacy and careful order, had no answer for them. Skarn fleets did not negotiate. Skarn fleets did not retreat. They simply came, in numbers too large to count, and they did not stop coming until every ship that could threaten them was gone. Human space was the first line they crossed. What happened next was recorded in exhaustive detail by Concord historians, replayed in military academies across a dozen species, and still, 43 years later, made Admiral Tovek Rel go quiet whenever anyone asked him about it directly, because he had been there. Humanity should have fallen in weeks. Their fleet was smaller, their worlds less defended, their military doctrine untested against an enemy like the Skarn. Instead, humanity did something the Concord's own war colleges had never modeled, because no Concord species would have considered it. They refused to fight the war the Skarn wanted to fight. They abandoned undefendable colonies without hesitation, moving entire populations in a matter of days, and let the Skarn take empty rock instead of people. They mined asteroid fields with weapons that had no business working as well as they did. They built ships, specifically designed to be expendable, cheap, and vicious, throwing away material advantage in favor of speed and unpredictability. And at the center of every major engagement, there was always one ship, always the same ship. A vessel that arrived at the worst possible moment for the Skarn, again and again, striking exactly where the fleet was weakest, and vanishing before anything could be sent to hunt it down. By the end of the war, Skarn commanders had given that single human ship a name in their own language, one that translated roughly to, the thing that waits in the dark. Human sailors, with the grim humor their species seemed to specialize in, simply called her the Widowmaker, because every major Skarn fleet formation she engaged ended the battle with far fewer ships than it started with, and far more empty seats where crew used to sit. The war ended not because the Skarn were destroyed. They were not. It ended because after 4 years of losses they had never experienced against any other species, the Skarn withdrew from the Concord border entirely, and had not returned since. Humanity had not won by being stronger. They had won by being the single most frightening thing the Skarn had ever tried to harvest, and by refusing, at every single turn, to behave the way a beaten species was supposed to behave. After that, the Concord stopped calling humans a minor client species. They started calling them, quietly, in private conversations between diplomats who thought no one important was listening, the most dangerous species in known space. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, the most dangerous, because no one, not even other humans, seemed entirely sure what humanity would do if it was ever truly threatened again. So, Yashel said, once the archive images had faded and the chamber had absorbed the weight of what she'd shown them, when I tell you that humanity's entire communications network went silent at the exact same moment their most decorated warship stopped reporting in, I need this assembly to understand what that might mean. It does not necessarily mean humanity is under attack. It may simply mean humanity is preparing for something, and does not want us to see it happen. Preparing for what? Vren demanded. Against whom? There has been no reported threat activity along the human border in years. I do not know, Yeshel admitted. That is precisely the problem. We have no visibility. For the first time since first contact, we cannot see what humanity is doing, and that ship, the one every delegate in this room recognizes, is somewhere out there with them, and it is not talking to us either. Admiral Tovek stepped forward, and something in his posture made the room settle again to listen. I served with humans during the incursion, he said. I flew escort for the Requiem twice. I want to tell you something about her captain, because I think it matters right now. He called up another image, a woman, mid-40s, dark-haired, standing in a ship's command bay, in an old recording, her uniform simple, her expression unreadable, in the way that made even fellow humans uneasy around her. The record identified her as Fleet Admiral Sarah Reyes. She does not send warnings before she acts, Tovek said. She does not posture. She does not threaten. When Admiral Reyes decides something needs to happen, it simply happens, and by the time anyone else understands what she has done, it is already finished. If Earth has gone dark, and if the Requiem has gone dark with it, I do not believe it is because humanity is hiding from a threat. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. I believe it is because they have found one, and they do not want it to know they are coming. Silence again. Longer this time, broken finally by a request from the Assembly's junior recorder, a small nervous creature whose job was simply to keep the official record accurate. Ambassador Korin, the recorder said, for the log, should this assembly classify the situation as a crisis or as an internal human matter outside Concord jurisdiction? Yeshel looked at the frozen image, still hanging above the platform, the long dark shape of the Requiem, hanging silent in an old recording of a battle the Concord still studied. Classify it, she said slowly, as both, because I do not think we have a choice about which one it turns out to be. 300 light-years away, in a system the Concord star charts did not even bother to name, a single beacon relay sat cold and dark on the edge of what had once been a busy human trade route. Its power core was intact. Its transmitter array was fully functional. It simply had nothing to send, because the order to go silent had come from the very top of humanity's chain of command, and every station, every colony, Every ship, still capable of receiving orders, had obeyed it within the same 6-minute window, a level of coordination that would have been impressive, even if the circumstances behind it had not been so unsettling. Somewhere beyond that dead beacon, in the dark between stars where no Concorde sensor array reached, humanity's most dangerous warship moved without lights, without transmissions, without anything that could give away her position to a threat none of her crew had yet spoken about out loud. And Admiral Sarah Reyes stood on her bridge, watching a tactical display that showed something the rest of the galaxy did not yet know existed, and did not yet know was coming for all of them. She had not sent a single message in 3 days. She did not intend to send one until she had something worth saying. But she would, and when she did, every species in the Concorde would remember exactly where they were when they heard it. Back on Threll Station, Ael Dorun had spent the days since the blackout doing the only thing her job actually allowed her to do: watching, recording, and waiting. She had filed her report to the Concorde's Regional Monitoring Authority within hours of the first dead relay, and had expected, given how minor her station usually was in the grand scheme of galactic affairs, that someone senior would eventually send a brief acknowledgement and move on to more pressing matters. Instead, within 2 days, Threll Station had become one of the most closely watched listening posts in the entire Reach, as analysts across a dozen Concorde agencies pored over every scrap of data her equipment had gathered in the hours before and after the silence began, searching for any clue as to what had actually happened. "They keep asking the same questions," Foss said one evening, sitting across from her in the station's cramped common area, nursing a cup of something warm that neither of them particularly enjoyed, but that had become a ritual anyway. Was there any unusual traffic before the blackout? Any pattern, any warning at all? "There wasn't," Ael said. "I've been through the logs a dozen times myself. Cargo manifests, a weather report from a colony called New Providence, someone requesting a music license transfer. Nothing that looked like anything." She rubbed her lower set of eyes, tired in the particular way that came from spending too many hours staring at data that refused to explain itself. Whatever they didn't leave a warning behind for anyone to find, not even by accident. "Do you think they're dead?" Foss asked, the question blunt in the way young officers sometimes were, before they learned to soften things for the sake of politeness. Ael considered the question seriously before answering, because Foss deserved a real answer rather than a comfortable one. "No," she said finally. "I don't think a dying civilization silences itself this cleanly. Dying is messy. Dying leaves wreckage, and distress calls, and confusion. This wasn't confusion. Every relay went dark within the same 6 minutes. Foss, that's not collapse, that's a decision." She looked out through the station's small viewport at the distant, unremarkable stars of the Kavarin Reach, ordinary and untroubled, giving no hint of whatever might be unfolding, far beyond the edge of what her instruments could see. "I just wish I understood what kind of decision requires an entire species to disappear from view all at once." Neither of them slept particularly well that night, and across the Kavarin Reach, and across a dozen other border regions where human traffic had once been a small, familiar thread in the galaxy's constant noise, other listening posts kept their own quiet, uneasy vigils, watching dead relays that refused to explain themselves. In the weeks that followed the initial emergency session, the Concorde Assembly settled into an uncomfortable new rhythm. Regular sessions continued, trade negotiations proceeded, the ordinary business of governing a diverse and sprawling alliance of species carried on largely as it always had, but underneath all of it ran a current of unease that touched every delegate differently, depending on their history with humanity, their politics, and their own private fears about what a vanished ally might mean for everyone else. Delegate Vren of the Karsu Combine used the silence as an opportunity to push, quietly at first, and then with growing boldness, for a reconsideration of several trade agreements that had historically favored human industry, arguing in closed committee sessions that a species which could vanish from galactic affairs without warning could hardly be considered a reliable long-term partner, and that prudent governance required contingency planning for a future that did not include Earth at all. He found more sympathetic ears than Yeshel Korin would have liked, particularly among delegates from species that had never quite recovered their competitive footing in industries humans had come to dominate over the past 2 decades, and for a period of several weeks, it seemed genuinely possible that the Assembly might begin unwinding decades of cooperative infrastructure on nothing more than fear and old resentment, dressed up as caution. Yashel fought that effort in every committee room she could reach, reminding anyone who would listen that humanity's silence, whatever its cause, did not erase 4 decades of alliance, trade, and shared sacrifice, and that abandoning a partnership at the first sign of trouble was precisely the kind of behavior that would teach every species in the Concord, humans included, that Concord friendship was conditional and shallow, rather than something worth honoring in hard times. She did not win every argument, but she won enough of them, delegate by delegate, committee by committee, that when Admiral Tovek Rel finally stood before the full assembly to argue for a mobilized reserve fleet, the chamber that received him was one still willing, however nervously, to extend humanity the benefit of the doubt. It helped, in ways Yashel privately found herself grateful for more than once, that Tovek carried a kind of authority in matters concerning humanity that few other Concord officials possessed. He had bled beside human soldiers. He had watched human pilots fly maneuvers that should have gotten them killed, and somehow didn't, again and again, until the entire Concord fleet had quietly begun studying human tactical doctrine as a subject worth teaching in its own right. When he spoke about humanity's capacity for sacrifice, for stubborn, unglamorous endurance in the face of odds that should have broken lesser fleets, he spoke as someone who had seen it firsthand, not as someone repeating stories secondhand from old briefings. And that difference mattered enormously, in a chamber full of delegates trying to decide how much faith to place in an ally who had, for reasons still unknown, gone completely silent. "I remember the 3rd year of the incursion," he told the assembly during one particularly tense session, when Vren had once again raised the question of contingency planning for a post-human galaxy. "I remember watching a human logistics officer, not a soldier, a logistics officer, organize the evacuation of an entire colony in under 30 hours, using nothing but civilian transport ships and sheer force of will, because the military transports meant to handle the evacuation had been destroyed 2 days earlier, and she refused to accept that this meant the evacuation itself was impossible. I have served alongside a dozen species in my career. I have never seen anything quite like the particular stubbornness humans bring to a crisis. If they have gone silent, it is not because they have given up. It is because they are doing something, and I would rather trust that instinct, built on everything I have personally witnessed, than abandon an ally out of fear built on nothing but our own discomfort with not knowing." The mobilization vote, when it finally came weeks later, passed by a wider margin than even Yashel had expected, and the quiet gathering of Concord reserve forces along the human border began not long after, a slow, careful build-up that most of the wider galaxy never even noticed, because it was conducted with the same discretion the Concord had learned, slowly and imperfectly, from watching how humanity itself preferred to operate under pressure. Meanwhile, far beyond the reach of any Concord sensor array, the human worlds that had gone dark by their own choice were living through a strange and difficult kind of patience that history would later remember as one of the quieter, less celebrated sacrifices of the entire crisis. Colonies that had built their economies around trade with Concord partners suddenly found themselves cut off from markets, unable to explain the disruption to anxious populations who had not been told, and in most cases could not be told, the true reason behind the silence. Families with relatives serving aboard ships scattered across the border went months without word, receiving only the same standardized, carefully worded assurance from Earth Defense Command. Your loved ones are engaged in essential defense operations. Further details cannot be shared at this time. Please trust that every effort is being made to protect them and bring them home. It was not an easy thing to ask an entire species to trust blindly, even when that species trusted its own government more than most. Protests were rare, but they happened. Small gatherings outside government offices on Earth and on the older Martian colonies, people demanding answers that officials genuinely could not give without risking everything the silence had been built to protect. Admiral Whitfield fielded angry questions from Planetary Council representatives on a near-daily basis throughout those months, absorbing frustration and fear from people who had every right to be frustrated and afraid, because he understood, better than almost anyone, that the cost of this operation was not being paid only by the crews of ships like the Requiem. It was being paid, quietly and invisibly, by every family holding on to hope with nothing solid to hold on to. by every worker whose livelihood depended on trade routes that had simply stopped existing, by an entire civilization asked to endure uncertainty, on nothing more than the promise that this uncertainty served a purpose too dangerous to explain. And yet, remarkably, the silence held. Not perfectly, not without strain, but it held, because enough people across enough human worlds understood, even without being told the specifics, that their government would not ask this of them without cause, and because the particular kind of trust that had been built over generations of shared struggle, from the earliest days of the space program, through the long, hard years of the Skarn incursion and beyond, was not the kind of trust that broke easily under pressure. It was the same stubborn, unglamorous endurance Tovek Rel had described to the Concord Assembly, showing itself not on a battlefield, but in millions of ordinary lives, quietly choosing, day after uncertain day, to keep faith with a silence they did not understand, because they trusted the people who had asked it of them. Somewhere in that vast, uneasy quiet, the countdown toward the dead system continued, unseen and unremarked, and the fate of everyone holding that silence rested, ultimately, on 7 ships and the woman who commanded them. 74 hours before the blackout, the UES Kestrel's Requiem had been sitting in a quiet parking orbit above New Providence, a border colony of about 400,000 people, doing the kind of unglamorous work most warships spent most of their time doing. Nothing in particular. Her sensors swept empty space out of habit rather than expectation. Her crew ran drills, ate bad food from the galley printers, and complained about the assignment, because New Providence was about as far from interesting as human space got, and the Requiem's crew, if they were honest with themselves, had spent enough of their careers wishing for interesting that they should have known better than to keep wishing. Admiral Sarah Reyes had commanded the Requiem for 11 years. She was 51 years old, though she looked older to people who did not know her, and younger to the ones who did, in the strange way that people who have survived a great deal sometimes do. She had joined the fleet at 19, fought in the last 2 years of the Skarn incursion as a junior tactical officer, and watched the captain she served under at the time make a decision so cold and so correct that it had saved 11,000 lives at the cost of the man's own ship and his own life. She had never forgotten the way he had given that order, without his voice shaking even once. She had spent the years since trying to be the kind of officer who could do the same thing if it was ever asked of her, and she had learned, slowly and at real cost, that the ability to make impossible decisions without flinching was not something you were born with. It was something you built, piece by piece, out of every hard choice you survived making. She was standing on the Requiem's bridge, reviewing a supply requisition that bored her considerably, when her sensor officer, a quiet, meticulous young man named Devon Okafor, said something that made her put the requisition down entirely. "Admiral, I'm getting a gravity anomaly at the edge of sensor range. It's not on any chart." Reyes crossed the bridge in 4 steps and looked at his display herself. A faint distortion sat at the outer limit of what the Requiem sensors could resolve, subtle enough that most systems would have filtered it out as noise. Okafor had not filtered it out, because Okafor did not trust anything he could not explain, and Reyes had promoted him twice, specifically because of that habit. "Define anomaly," she said. "Something's bending local space-time in a way that doesn't match any drive signature in our database. It's not a ship we recognize. It's not natural either. Natural gravity wells don't move like that." He hesitated. "Admiral, it's the same shape as the readings from the Skarn incursion, the old ones, from the deep archive." The bridge went very quiet. Reyes had read every file in that archive personally, more than once, in the years since the war ended. She knew exactly what Okafor meant, because she had seen those readings before, on a night 15 years earlier, when she had been a junior officer, standing exactly where Okafor now stood, watching a captain's face go pale at a sensor return that looked, at first glance, like nothing at all. "Time to intercept range for our long-range array?" 6 hours if it holds current heading, Admiral, but it's not holding heading, it's decelerating. Whatever it is, it's slowing down, like it's... Okafor paused, choosing his next word carefully. "Like it's waiting." Reyes did not answer immediately. She stood with her hands folded behind her back, looking at the small, distorted shape on the display, and thought about every briefing she had ever sat through on what the Skarn incursion had actually cost humanity, the parts that never made it into the official Concord histories because the Concord had never needed to know them. The colonies evacuated in 6 days that were never rebuilt because there had not been enough survivors left to justify it. The ships that vanished with full crews and were simply marked lost because there had been no time and no resources to go looking for wreckage. The Skarn had called it harvesting, and humanity had spent 4 years proving they were too expensive to harvest, and the price of that proof had been paid in full by people whose names were carved into a memorial wall on Earth that Reyes had visited exactly once, because she had found she could not go back a second time. The Skarn had withdrawn from Concord space 15 years ago. They had not been destroyed. They had simply left, the way a predator leaves a wounded prey animal alone. Once it becomes clear the wound will heal into claws. Comms, Reyes said. Get me fleet command. Priority channel, encrypted, command authorization only. The response came back 9 minutes later, and it came not from a duty officer, but from Fleet Admiral Marcus Whitfield himself, the head of the entire Earth Defense Fleet, a man Reyes had served under for 2 decades and trusted more than almost anyone alive. His face on the screen was tired, in a way that told her he already knew, or already suspected, exactly what she was about to report. Sarah, he said, skipping rank the way he only did when a conversation was about to become serious, in a way protocol could not hold. Tell me what you're seeing. She told him, the anomaly, the gravity signature, the deceleration pattern that suggested something was slowing down to observe rather than approach directly, which was, if anything, worse than a direct approach would have been, because it meant patience, and patience meant planning. Whitfield was silent for a long moment after she finished. We've had 3 other reports in the last 18 hours, he said finally. Fenrir Station, the Callisto Relay, a survey team out past the Oort boundary that we haven't heard from in 6 hours. Same signature pattern each time. Sarah, I need you to hear this clearly, because I'm only going to say it once on an open command channel, and then we're changing protocols. The analysts think this is a Skarn reconnaissance pattern, not an attack, not yet. They're mapping us again. The way they did 18 months before the incursion started. Reyes felt something settle in her chest, cold and very calm. The particular kind of calm that came only after the fear had already passed through and left something harder behind it. They're coming back, she said. We don't know that for certain. Marcus, her voice did not rise, but something in it made even the officers around her on the bridge go still. You didn't call me on a command priority encrypted channel because you think it's uncertain. Whitfield's jaw tightened. No, he admitted. I called because the analysts think we have somewhere between 4 and 11 months before a full incursion fleet arrives, based on the reconnaissance pattern and how long it took last time. And I called because I need the Requiem in a specific place when that happens. And I need her there without the Skarn, or the Concorde, or anyone else in this galaxy knowing she's there until it's far too late to matter. What followed over the next 71 hours was, in the private opinion of every officer who lived through it, the single most demanding stretch of coordinated planning the Earth Defense Fleet had undertaken since the original incursion itself, and it happened almost entirely in silence, because silence was the entire point. The Skarn's reconnaissance pattern from 15 years earlier followed a specific, well-documented logic. They mapped a target civilization's communication infrastructure first, identifying every relay, every listening post, every channel through which warning could travel, because a Skarn harvest depended above all else on speed and surprise. A target that could raise an alarm and coordinate a defense in time was a target that became expensive. A target that could be struck before it even understood an attack was happening was a target that fell in days rather than years. The Skarn had learned, at terrible cost to humanity the first time, that human defense coordination was faster and more resilient than almost any other species they had harvested. They would not make the mistake of underestimating that speed a second time, which meant their coming attack would not simply strike military targets. It would strike the network first, every relay and outpost that let humanity talk to itself and to the wider galaxy, in the opening minutes of the assault, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of rapid, coordinated response that had cost them so dearly before. Admiral Whitfield's plan, worked out in a series of encrypted sessions with Reyes and a small circle of senior officers over those first hours, inverted the entire premise. If the Skarn's opening move would be to silence humanity's communications, then humanity would silence itself first, on its own terms, at a moment of its own choosing, and use that silence to do the one thing the Skarn would never expect a civilization under threat to do. Disappear entirely from view, mid-preparation, so that when the Skarn fleet finally arrived expecting the same defensive posture that had bloodied them 15 years earlier, they would instead find nothing where they expected everything, and everything where they expected nothing. It meant giving up something enormous. It meant the Concord, humanity's allies and trading partners for over 4 decades, would see Earth vanish from every channel, with no explanation, and would be left to assume the worst, with no way for Earth to reassure them, because any reassurance sent out would also be a signal that could be traced, monitored, and used by the very enemy they were hiding from. It meant every human colony beyond the immediate defensive perimeter would spend months not knowing whether their homeworld was under attack, at peace, or something in between. It meant that from the outside, humanity would look exactly like a civilization in the middle of collapsing. Reyes had argued against exactly one part of the plan, in a conversation with Whitfield that neither of them ever fully documented in the official record. "You're asking an entire species to go dark, and trust that we know what we're doing," she said. "The Concord will panic. Some of them will assume we've been destroyed. Some will assume we've turned hostile. Either way, we lose 15 years of relationship building the moment this starts, and we may never fully get it back, even if we win." "I know," Whitfield said. "Then why not send one warning, one message to the Concord Assembly, encrypted, explaining what we're doing, and why? Because the moment we send that message, we've told the Skarn exactly what our plan is too, Sarah, and you know it. Their reconnaissance drones are already in our space. Any transmission that leaves human territory in the next several months could be intercepted, and if the Skarn learn we know they're coming, and that we're preparing a trap instead of a defense, they will simply change their approach, and everything we're about to build gets thrown away for nothing." He rubbed his eyes, and for a moment, he looked less like a fleet admiral, and more like a man who had not slept properly in 3 days. "I don't like it either, but I would rather the Concord be frightened and confused for a few months than have this fleet arrive to find us exactly where they expect us to be." In the end, Reyes had agreed, because she understood the logic, even as she hated what it would cost, and because 11 years of commanding the Requiem had taught her that the hardest decisions were rarely the ones with a comfortable answer hiding somewhere inside them. The order went out to every human world, station and vessel, capable of receiving it at 0400 Concord Standard, delivered not as a broadcast, but as a pre-positioned, encrypted directive that activated simultaneously, across the entire network, the moment a single authorization code was transmitted from Earth Defense Command. Every relay station shut down, every outbound channel closed. Every ship still capable of independent movement received sealed orders to proceed to one of 11 staging points scattered across human space, coordinates known only to their commanding officers, with instructions not to be opened until the ship was already underway. The Requiem's own orders came directly from Whitfield, hand-delivered by encrypted courier drone, rather than transmitted through any channel that could be intercepted, and Reyes read them alone in her quarters, before calling her senior staff together. She was to take the Requiem, and a task force of 6 additional vessels being assembled from ships already scattered along the border, and position herself at a specific set of coordinates, deep in unclaimed space, beyond the edge of both human and Concord territory. A dead system with no name, no resources, and no reason for anyone, Skarn or otherwise, to expect a human fleet to be waiting there. Analysts believed, based on the geometry of the original incursion and the movement patterns of the reconnaissance signatures already detected, that this system sat directly along the most efficient approach vector for a Skarn fleet intending to strike Earth's core worlds. If the analysis was correct, the main Skarn assault fleet would pass through that empty system, on its way to the heart of human space, confident that nothing stood between them and their target, exactly the way they had been confident 15 years earlier. They would be wrong. And the Requiem would be waiting to make sure they understood exactly how wrong, before the rest of the Earth Defense Fleet, repositioned and hidden throughout human space, over the following months, under cover of the same silence, closed in from every other direction at once. Reyes stood in front of her senior officers in the Requiem's briefing room, all 7 of them, the people she trusted most in the entire fleet, and told them the truth without softening any part of it. "We are going to sit in an empty system with 6 ships, and wait for a fleet that outnumbers us by a factor none of the analysts want to say out loud in front of me," she said. We are going to do it without backup, without reinforcement, and without any way to call for help, because calling for help is the one thing that would ruin everything the rest of humanity is building behind us. If the analysis is wrong, we will have wasted months in the dark for nothing. If the analysis is right, we will very likely be the first human ships the Skarn fleet encounters when it finally arrives. And our job will not be to win that fight outright. Our job will be to survive long enough, and hurt them badly enough, that the fleet behind us has time to do what it needs to do. No one in the room spoke for a long moment. Then her second-in-command, a broad-shouldered veteran named Captain Idris Baptiste, who had served with her for 9 of her 11 years in command, asked the only question that mattered. "And if we don't survive it, Admiral?" Reyes looked at him, and at the rest of them, and thought about the captain who had given an order, without his voice shaking, 15 years earlier, and about everything she had built out of the memory of that moment since. "Then we make sure whatever's left of that Skarn fleet arrives at Earth already bleeding," she said, "and we make sure it costs them enough that they remember, the way they remembered last time, that harvesting humanity is never, ever worth the price." 71 hours after that briefing, the last human relay station went dark, and the UES Kestrel's Requiem, along with 6 other ships, slipped quietly out of known space entirely, running silent, running dark, and running directly toward a fight that no one in the wider galaxy yet knew was coming. The 6 other ships assigned to Reyes's task force arrived at the rendezvous point over the following 9 days, each of them making the journey independently, under their own sealed orders, using routes designed to avoid any pattern a watching enemy might recognize as coordinated movement. Reyes met each captain personally as their ships arrived, because she had learned long ago that a task force built in a hurry, under pressure, with crews who had never served together before, needed its commander to build trust quickly and deliberately, rather than assume rank alone, would be enough to hold 7 independent crews together through what was coming. The first to arrive was the cruiser UES Longwatch, commanded by Captain Elena Vasquez, a stern, precise officer with a reputation for running the tightest engineering department in the fleet. The second was the destroyer UES Ironclad Promise, under Captain Marcus Chen, whose crew had served together for 6 years, and had the kind of easy, practiced coordination that came only from a long partnership. Then came the light cruiser UES Steadfast, the frigate UES Quiet Resolve, the corvette UES Fair Warning, under the young and fiercely capable Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, and finally, the heavy cruiser UES Bulwark, the largest ship in the task force apart from the Requiem herself, commanded by a taciturn veteran named Captain Hassan Okonkwo, who had fought in the original Skarn incursion as a young ensign and had never quite lost the wary, watchful habits the war had taught him. Reyes gathered all 6 captains aboard the Requiem for a joint briefing on the 10th day, laying out the full scope of Threadneedle in detail for the first time, sparing no one the difficulty of what lay ahead. She watched their faces carefully as she spoke, gauging not their courage, which she did not doubt, but their understanding, because a plan this precise would only work if every commander involved grasped not just their own role, but the shape of the whole operation, well enough to adapt when the inevitable chaos of battle scrambled the careful timing they were building now. "I won't pretend this is a plan with a guaranteed outcome," she told them, standing at the head of the Requiem's briefing table, with a tactical display showing the dead system's asteroid field rotating slowly above them. "We are 7 ships. If Fleet Command's analysis is correct, we may be facing a force 10 times our size, possibly more. Our job is not to win a conventional engagement. Our job is to be unpredictable, to bleed them faster than they can adapt, and to hold this system long enough for the rest of the fleet, positioned elsewhere throughout human space, to close the trap we've spent months building. If any of you believe your crew is not ready for what that means, tell me now, quietly, and I will find another use for your ship that does not require this kind of risk. I will not think less of you for it." No one spoke. Captain Okonkwo, the oldest among them and the only one present who had fought the Skarn before, finally broke the silence with a small, grim smile. "Admiral, respectfully, most of us signed up for this fleet because someone told us stories about what the Requiem did during the incursion. We didn't come this far to sit out the next one." The months that followed were spent in a punishing routine of drills, simulations, and endless small adjustments to Threadneedle's timing, as the task force learned to operate together as a single coordinated unit, rather than 7 independent crews thrown together by circumstance. Reyes ran her people hard, harder than most of them had ever been run before, because she understood, from hard experience, that the difference between a plan that worked and a plan that got everyone killed often came down to nothing more than how many times a crew had rehearsed the exact maneuver they would need to execute under fire, in the dark, with casualties mounting and communications degrading. She also spent those months getting to know her people in a way command responsibilities did not always allow. She learned that Devon Okafor had joined the fleet after losing an older sister during the original incursion, and that his obsessive attention to sensor anomalies came from a promise he had made himself, as a teenager, never to let anything slip past him the way something must have slipped past whoever had been watching the sensors the day his sister's colony fell silent. She learned that Idris Baptiste kept a small, worn photograph of his 2 children tucked inside his uniform jacket, not because he needed reminding of them, but because he said it helped him make harder decisions more clearly, knowing exactly what kind of galaxy he was trying to protect. She learned that Priya Anand, barely 30 years old and already commanding her own ship, had turned down a promotion to a safer administrative posting twice, because she believed, with a conviction Reyes recognized from her own younger self, that the people who most needed protecting deserved officers willing to stand between them and danger, rather than manage the danger from a comfortable distance. These were the people Reyes would lead into the dead system when the Skarn fleet finally arrived, and in the quiet hours of ship's night, when the drills were finished and the corridors had gone still, she found herself thinking often about the weight of that responsibility, and about the captain who had taught her, 15 years earlier, exactly what it cost to carry it well. 2 months into their vigil in the dead system, with no sign yet of the Skarn fleet the reconnaissance signatures had promised, doubt began to creep into the edges of the task force's discipline, the way it always did during a long wait for a threat that refused to announce its arrival on any convenient schedule. Reyes noticed it in small things: crews growing short-tempered during drills, junior officers second-guessing orders they would have followed without hesitation during the first weeks, a general fraying at the edges that she recognized as the natural cost of asking people to sustain peak readiness for an enemy that might, for all any of them knew, have changed its plans entirely, or been delayed by circumstances no one in the task force could see or predict. She addressed it directly, calling an all-hands briefing broadcast to every ship in the task force, standing before her assembled crew with the same plain honesty she had used with her captains months earlier. "I know this waiting is hard," she said. "I know some of you are beginning to wonder if the intelligence was wrong, if we've spent months preparing for a fight that isn't coming, if all of this, the silence, the isolation, the strain on the people we love back home, has been for nothing. I want to tell you something I believe with everything I have. The Skarn are coming. I do not know exactly when. I do not know if it will be tomorrow or another 2 months from now, but I know the pattern in that reconnaissance data, because I have studied it more carefully than almost anything else in my career, and I know that pattern does not lie. When they arrive, and they will arrive, the only thing that will matter is whether we are still ready, still sharp, still trusting each other enough to execute a plan that depends on every single one of us doing our part exactly right. So I am asking you, not as your commanding officer, but as someone who has to trust you with my own life just as much as you have to trust me with yours, to hold the line a little longer, whatever it costs, because the alternative, being caught unprepared the way we were 15 years ago, is a cost I am not willing to let any of us pay again." The speech did not erase the strain entirely, because no speech could, but it steadied something in the task force that had begun to slip, and the drills continued with renewed focus in the weeks that followed. It was, in the end, exactly 74 days after that briefing that Devon Okafor's sensors first picked up the faint, unmistakable gravity signature of an approaching fleet at the edge of detection range, and every hour of preparation, every hard month of waiting in the dark, was finally about to be tested against the enemy it had all been built to meet. 2 weeks into humanity's silence, the Concord Assembly authorized what Ambassador Yeshil Koren had spent most of those 2 weeks arguing for. A diplomatic scout vessel, unarmed and clearly marked, would be sent toward the edge of human space to attempt contact through official channels. Not an invasion of human territory, not an act of aggression. Simply an attempt to ask, politely and openly, whether humanity's oldest allies in the galaxy were alive. The vessel chosen was the Concord diplomatic ship Patient Hand, a slow, unarmed vessel built specifically for first contact and sensitive negotiation work, crewed by a small team hand-picked by Yeshel herself. She insisted on going personally, over the objections of nearly the entire Assembly Security Council, because she had spent 11 years building relationships with human diplomats and military officers, and she refused to send anyone else to knock on a door she had helped open in the first place. If something has happened to them, she told the council in her final briefing before departure, then someone who actually knows them should be the one to find out, not a stranger reading a report afterward. Admiral Tovek Rel insisted on providing an armed escort, 3 Concord warships keeping station at a respectful distance, while the Patient Hand made its approach. A compromise Yeshel accepted only after Tovek pointed out, not unkindly, that if something dangerous enough to silence an entire species was waiting on the other side of that border, sending an unarmed diplomat in completely alone would not honor her courage so much as waste it. The journey took 11 days. For the first 9 of them, sensors detected nothing unusual. Empty space, the familiar background hum of a quiet border region, no sign of hostile activity, no sign of anything at all, which Yeshel found almost more unsettling than an obvious threat would have been. A dead border was not a peaceful border. It was simply a border, with the noise turned off. On the 10th day, the Patient Hand's sensor officer, a careful, soft-spoken Tasari named Brawl, called Yeshel to the bridge, with a report that made the hair on the back of her neck rise, a physical reaction she had not experienced in years. "Ambassador, we're picking up wreckage." The debris field spread across nearly 200,000 kilometers of empty space, and as the Patient Hand slowed to a careful crawl to avoid the larger fragments, Yeshel stood at the viewport and watched pieces of ships drift past in the starlight, silent and broken, tumbling slowly end over end, the way dead things tumbled in the vacuum. Most of the wreckage was unrecognizable, twisted metal and shattered hull plating that told her nothing except that a battle had happened here, and that it had been violent. But some pieces were recognizable, and what made Yeshel's stomach turn cold was that none of them were human. "Brawl," she said quietly, "run those hull fragments against our species database. All of them." It took nearly 20 minutes, because the debris was so extensively damaged, but when the results came back, Admiral Tovek, who had come aboard the Patient Hand personally when the wreckage field was first detected, went very still as he read them over Brawl's shoulder. "These match no known Concord hull design," Brawl reported. "Composition, structural geometry, propulsion residue. None of it corresponds to anything in the archive, but there is a partial match, Ambassador. A low-confidence one, from an archive dataset marked restricted." "Show me," Yeshel said. The image that appeared on the display was old, grainy, pulled from a 15-year-old military archive that Tovek recognized immediately, because he had helped compile it himself, in the aftermath of a war he had never fully stopped thinking about. "Skarn," he said, and the word landed in the small bridge like a stone, dropped into still water. "Those are Skarn hull fragments." Yeshel turned to look at him, her 4 blue eyes wide. "The Skarn withdrew from Concord space 15 years ago. They have not been seen since. I am aware of that, Ambassador. I fought the war that made them leave." Tovek's voice had gone flat and controlled in the particular way it went when he was working very hard to keep old fear from showing through. "This wreckage is recent, days old, perhaps less, based on the thermal decay pattern, which means either the Skarn have returned to this region, or something has been fighting them here, very recently, and by the composition of this debris field." He paused, studying the tangled mass of shattered hulls drifting silently past the viewport. "Ambassador, I am not seeing anywhere near enough human wreckage in this field to account for a battle against a Skarn force this size. Whatever fought here, and won, did so while suffering remarkably light losses." Yeshel felt something shift in her chest, a strange and complicated mixture of dread and something almost like hope, sharp enough that she had to sit down in the nearest chair to steady herself. "Then Earth is not silent because it has fallen," she said slowly. "It is silent because it is winning a war none of us knew had started." Perhaps, Tovek said. Or perhaps this was the opening skirmish of a war humanity has only just begun, and the worst of it is still ahead of them. He looked out at the drifting wreckage, the broken hulls of a species that had once terrified an entire quadrant of the galaxy, now reduced to silent debris. I would very much like to know which one it is before we go any further. They did not have to wait long to find out, though the answer, when it came, arrived in a form none of them expected. On the 11th day, as the patient hand cautiously continued its approach toward the human border, its long-range sensors picked up a single vessel on an intercept course, moving fast, running with minimal power signature, the kind of profile that suggested either a very cautious civilian ship or a warship deliberately trying not to be seen. Brawl flagged it immediately, and Tovek, watching the approach vector and the subtle characteristics of its drive signature, felt his four eyes widen in recognition before the ship's transponder had even finished resolving. "That drive signature," he said. "I know that drive signature." The Requiem's task force had, in fact, not been the only human vessel operating in the shadows during the months of silence. Smaller scout ships, fast and expendable, had been quietly assigned to monitor the outer edges of human space for exactly this kind of Concord approach, under strict orders to avoid contact wherever possible, but with discretionary authority to intervene if a friendly vessel appeared to be wandering into genuine danger. The ship now closing on the patient hand was one of these, a light corvette called the UES Fair Warning, and its young commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, had been watching the Concord ships for 6 hours, before finally deciding, against the spirit if not quite the letter of her orders, that letting an old ally sail blind through a battlefield that might still be active was a worse risk than breaking radio silence for a single, careful, coded transmission. The message that reached the patient hand's bridge was short, tightly encrypted using an old Concord human diplomatic cipher that had not been updated in years, but that both sides still kept on file for exactly this kind of emergency, and it was addressed, specifically, to Ambassador Yeshel Koren by name. "Ambassador, this is Lieutenant Commander Anand, UES Fair Warning. I cannot explain our silence, and I am not authorized to try. I can tell you this much. You are entering an active conflict zone. Do not proceed further on your current heading. Turn back to Concord space and wait. If Earth survives what is coming, we will contact you when it is safe to do so, and not before. Please trust that this silence has a reason, even if I cannot give it to you. We have not forgotten who our friends are." Yeshel read the message twice, standing very still on the bridge of the patient hand, surrounded by the drifting wreckage of a battle that had apparently only been the beginning of something much larger. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Send a reply," she told Brawl. "Tell Commander Anand that the Concord Assembly trusts humanity's judgment, and that we will withdraw as requested." She paused, and something in her expression made even Tovek, who had known her for over a decade, look at her with new attention. "And tell her this, exactly as I say it. Tell her that whatever Earth is facing, it does not face it alone by our choice, only by its own, and that when this is over, the door back to us will still be open, always." The Fair Warning acknowledged the message and peeled away, without ever coming close enough for a visual sighting, vanishing back into the dark the same way it had appeared, and the patient hand, along with its 3-ship escort, began the long, uneasy journey back to Concord space, carrying with it the first hard evidence in over 2 weeks that Earth was not destroyed, but was also, unmistakably, at war. The report Yeshel delivered to the Assembly upon her return divided the chamber more sharply than any single briefing in recent memory. Some delegates, Vran of the Karsu Combine loudest among them, argued that a human war against the Skarn, a species with a documented history of harvesting entire civilizations, was precisely the kind of existential threat the Concord should be actively assisting with, regardless of humanity's request for silence, because a Skarn victory over Earth would eventually become everyone's problem. Others argued the opposite, that humanity had asked, clearly and directly, to be left alone to fight this war on its own terms, and that a species with humanity's track record against exactly this enemy deserved to have that request honored, rather than second-guessed by allies who had not been invited to help. It was Admiral Tovek Rel who finally settled the debate, not with an argument, but with a memory he had never shared publicly before. standing at the center platform with the weight of the entire assembly's attention on him. 15 years ago, he said, I watched the Skarn burn 3 worlds in a single month, worlds belonging to species that are not represented in this chamber anymore, because there was no one left to send a delegate. I watched the Concord debate, exactly as we are debating now, whether to commit forces to a fight some believed was not yet truly our fight. By the time we decided, humanity had already turned the tide alone, at a cost none of us fully understood until years later, and we arrived at the end of that war, in time to help clean up a victory we had not helped win. He paused, letting the silence settle over the chamber. I do not know what humanity is fighting right now. I do not know if they need our help, or if offering it uninvited would be an insult to a species that has never once asked us to fight its battles for it. But I know this. If we spend the next several months debating instead of preparing, and it turns out humanity does need help before this is over, we will once again arrive too late to matter. So I am asking this assembly, not to send our fleets across the border uninvited, but to mobilize a reserve force, quietly, along our side of that border, ready to move the instant humanity asks us to. Not because we distrust their strength, because we owe them the readiness to stand beside them the moment they call, and we did not do that the last time it mattered. The vote passed with a wide majority, and over the following weeks, a Concord reserve fleet began quietly gathering along the human border, out of sight of any Skarn reconnaissance that might still be watching, waiting for a signal that no one could say for certain would ever come. Far beyond that border, in the dead, unnamed system where the Requiem's task force had been holding position for over 2 months, Admiral Sarah Reyes stood on her bridge in the deep quiet of ship's night, looking at a tactical display that had, in the last 6 hours, begun showing exactly what every analyst back on Earth had spent months predicting. Contacts, dozens of them, at the extreme edge of sensor range, moving on a heading that would bring them directly through this empty, forgotten system on their way toward the heart of human space. The Skarn fleet had arrived. Reyes stood very still for a long moment, watching the growing cluster of contacts resolve slowly into individual signatures on her display, and then she turned to her communications officer, her voice calm, in the particular way that only came from having rehearsed this exact moment, in her mind, more times than she could count. "Get me a channel," she said. "It's time to break silence." Before that order reached the wider galaxy, however, there was a quieter conversation happening aboard the Patient Hand during its slow, uneasy return journey to Concord space, one that would shape how the assembly received the news when it finally came. Yashel Corin had spent the days following the encounter with the Fair Warning, turning the exchange over in her mind again and again, searching for any detail she might have missed, any clue buried in Lieutenant Commander Anand's careful, guarded message that might tell her more than the young officer had been authorized to share. She said if Earth survives what is coming, Yashel said to Tovek one evening, the two of them sharing a quiet meal in the Patient Hand's small officer's mess, the wreckage field they had passed through still weighing heavily on both their minds. Not if we win. Not when this is over. If Earth survives, that is not the language of a species confident in its own strength, Tovek. That is the language of people who understand, clearly, that they might lose. Humans rarely speak in comfortable language when the truth is uncomfortable, Tovek said. It is one of the things I have always respected about them, even when it unsettled me. They do not soften bad odds to make themselves feel better about facing them. He set down his cup and looked at her directly. I do not think that phrasing was an accident, Ambassador. I think Commander Anand chose those words deliberately, knowing exactly what they would tell us, because she could not say more, without risking the very secrecy her orders required her to protect. It was, in its way, a kind of honesty wrapped inside the silence. Yashel considered this for a long moment. Then, we are not simply waiting to hear whether Earth has survived some minor skirmish, she said slowly. We may be waiting to learn whether an entire species has survived at all. The weight of that realization traveled with them for the remainder of the journey back to Concord space, and it was this understanding, carried personally by Yeshel and Tovek into every subsequent conversation with the wider assembly, that lent such urgency to Tovek's argument for a mobilized reserve fleet. It was not simply caution or old loyalty driving the decision to gather forces along the border. It was the growing, private conviction of two people who had seen the wreckage firsthand, that the crisis unfolding beyond that border might be far larger and far more dangerous than anything the rest of the galaxy yet understood. The weeks of mobilization that followed tested the Concorde's own capacity for coordinated action in ways that surprised even seasoned officers like Tovek, who had spent decades navigating the slow, deliberative pace at which a coalition of dozens of species typically moved. Assembling a reserve fleet quickly, and quietly enough to avoid drawing the attention of whatever threat had silenced humanity, required a degree of trust and rapid cooperation between species that did not always share Tovek's confidence in the wisdom of the effort. Not every delegate who had voted in favor of mobilization did so out of genuine faith in humanity's cause. Some, Tovek knew, had voted out of simple self-interest, calculating that a weakened or destroyed Skarn threat, whatever its outcome, would ultimately serve Concorde security, regardless of what happened to Earth in the process. Others voted out of old debts, remembering specific moments during the Skarn incursion, when human forces had diverted resources, or risked ships, to protect Concorde assets that were not, strictly speaking, their responsibility to defend. Ambassador Yeshil Korin found herself, in the weeks of mobilization, spending as much time managing the complicated, sometimes contradictory motivations behind the fleet's assembly as she had once spent building the original relationship between Earth and the Concorde decades earlier. She did not mind the work. If anything, she found a strange comfort in it, because the effort itself, however messy and imperfect the motivations behind it, represented exactly the kind of alliance she had spent her career trying to build, one where different species, for different reasons, still found themselves capable of standing together when it mattered, even amid uncertainty, even without complete information, even when trust had been strained nearly to its breaking point by months of unexplained silence. Admiral Tovek Rel took personal command of the assembled reserve fleet, a force that ultimately numbered 43 vessels, drawn from 12 different Concorde member species, an unusually diverse composition for a single unified command that required weeks of careful diplomatic and logistical work to assemble smoothly. He drilled the fleet relentlessly during the weeks it waited along the border, aware that a coalition force with no history of operating together would need every available hour of practice if it was ever called upon to fight alongside a human command structure it had never trained with directly. "We may never be needed," he told his assembled captains during one such drill, a diverse gathering of species standing together in a briefing room that would have been unimaginable to Concorde officers a generation earlier. Humanity may resolve whatever crisis it faces entirely on its own, exactly as they resolved the Skarn incursion 15 years ago, and this fleet may spend months sitting at this border only to be quietly stood down once the silence finally lifts. I would consider that outcome a success, not a waste of our time. But if we are called upon, I want every one of you to understand that we will not have the luxury of a lengthy adjustment period to learn how to fight alongside human forces. We must be ready from the very first moment, coordinated and disciplined, because whatever crisis has silenced an entire species is not a crisis that will wait patiently for us to catch up. It was during this long, tense period of waiting that word finally reached the reserve fleet, and simultaneously, the full Concorde assembly of the transmission Admiral Sarah Reyes had sent from the dead system, breaking 3 months of silence with a message that confirmed everything Yeshil and Tovek had feared and hoped for in equal measure. The Skarn had returned. Earth was not merely surviving in isolation, it was actively fighting for its survival, in a battle already underway, against an enemy whose reputation for harvesting entire civilizations was known and feared across the Concorde. Tovek received the transmission aboard his flagship within minutes of its arrival, and he did not hesitate. He had spent weeks preparing exactly for this possibility, and the moment the message confirmed what he had long suspected, he issued the order that would carry the reserve fleet toward the dead system at maximum burn, careful to honor the explicit boundaries of Reyes's request, even as he moved his ships into position to help the instant that help was called for. "Set course," he told his helm officer. 11 hours to the system's edge. We hold position there until we are asked to do more. But I want every ship ready to move the moment that request comes, because I do not intend to let humanity fight this battle, wondering whether their oldest allies would come if called. As the reserve fleet began its long journey toward the dead system, Ambassador Yeshil Korin stood once more before the full Concorde assembly, relaying Reyes's transmission in its entirety, to a chamber that listened in a silence far different from the uneasy, fearful quiet of the crisis's early days. This was the silence of an audience finally beginning to understand the true shape of what they had been waiting 3 months to learn, and as Yeshel finished reading the message aloud, she found herself hoping, with an intensity that surprised even her, that the silence about to fall over that distant, nameless system would not be the last thing the galaxy ever heard from the ship, and the admiral, who had sent it. The Skarn fleet that entered the dead system numbered 211 vessels, a number Devon Okafor read off his sensor display, in a voice that stayed remarkably level considering what it meant for the 7 ships waiting to meet them. Reyes had expected a large fleet. The analysts back on Earth had modeled numbers between 100 and 300, based on the reconnaissance patterns and the scale of the original incursion. 211 sat almost exactly in the middle of that range, which meant, for better or worse, that Earth Defense Command's months of planning had been built on a reasonably accurate guess. It did not make the number any less enormous when it was sitting on her own tactical display, real, and close, and closing. Formation analysis, Reyes said. Standard Skarn deep strike configuration, Okafor reported. Heavy assault vessels at the core, screening ships on the flanks, a smaller detachment running ahead as scouts. Same pattern from the incursion archives, Admiral. They haven't changed their doctrine. Good, Reyes said quietly, because we built our entire plan around the assumption that they wouldn't. The Skarn were not a species that valued creativity in warfare the way humans did. Their entire civilization functioned on a logic of overwhelming, repeatable efficiency. Identify the pattern that had worked before, apply it again, and trust in sheer scale to compensate for any weakness the pattern might contain. It was a philosophy that had harvested 11 civilizations before it ever encountered humanity, and it was a philosophy that had cost the Skarn dearly, 15 years earlier, precisely because humanity refused to fight, according to any pattern the Skarn had ever catalogued. Reyes was gambling, and had been gambling for 2 months in the silence and dark of this dead system. That 15 years had not been long enough for the Skarn to unlearn a doctrine that old. Captain Baptiste, she said, turning to her second-in-command, signal the task force. Execute Threadneedle. On my mark. The plan had a name that meant nothing to anyone outside the task force, chosen months earlier by a tactical planning team back on Earth, who had a habit of naming operations after things that required precision to avoid disaster, and Threadneedle required exactly that. The 7 ships under Reyes's command were not going to meet 211 Skarn vessels in open battle. No sane commander would attempt that, and Reyes was, whatever else people said about her, a sane commander. Instead, Threadneedle called for the task force to use the dead system's own terrain, a dense field of rocky debris left over from a planetary collision millions of years earlier, as cover for a strike that depended entirely on speed, precision, and the specific, predictable weakness Skarn formations had always shown at the seams between their screening ships and their heavy assault core. Task force is in position, Baptiste reported. All ships confirm ready. Reyes looked at the display one final time, watching the Skarn fleet continue its slow, confident advance into a system it believed to be empty, and thought, briefly, of the captain who had given an order 15 years earlier, without his voice shaking, and of every officer under her command right now, who was trusting her to be the same kind of person he had been in the worst moment of his life. Comms, she said. Send it now. All channels, unencrypted, wide broadcast. Let them hear this coming. The message that left the Kestrel's requiem at that moment traveled in every direction at once, on every frequency the ship possessed, deliberately unencrypted, so that anyone within range, friend or enemy, would receive it clearly. It reached the nearest human relay station within minutes, and from there, because Earth Defense Command had pre-positioned exactly this contingency months earlier, it was relayed instantly and simultaneously to every human world, every human ship, and, through a private diplomatic channel Yeshel Korin had insisted be kept open specifically for this possibility, to the Concord Assembly itself. It reached the assembly chamber in the middle of a routine session, interrupting Ambassador Yeshel Korin mid-sentence, as an aide rushed a data slate to her platform, with a message that had just arrived through the emergency diplomatic channel, marked with a priority flag the Concord had not seen activated in over a decade. She read it once, silently, and then read it aloud to the entire chamber, her voice carrying through the amplifiers to every delegate present, because she understood, even as she spoke, that this was a moment history would remember, and she wanted every species in that room to hear it, exactly as it had been sent. This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Reyes, UES Kestrel's Requiem, transmitting on all frequencies. To Earth, to every human world and colony, to every ally who has waited in patient silence for word of what has become of us. The silence ends now, because it no longer needs to protect anything. The enemy we hid from is in front of us. The Skarn have returned, in force, exactly as we believed they would, and they believe they have found us unprepared, exactly as they did 15 years ago. They are wrong, the same way they were wrong then, and in the next several hours, they are going to learn that lesson again, at whatever cost it takes to teach it to them thoroughly. To the crews of every ship in this task force, it has been the honor of my career to command you. To Earth, and to every colony that trusted this silence without understanding it, hold on a little longer. And to our friends in the Concord, who I know have been watching a dark border and wondering what became of us, we did not forget you. We simply could not risk letting our enemy overhear what we were building. Watch this system now. Whatever happens here in the next few hours will tell you everything you need to know about what humanity is, and what it is willing to do to protect what it loves. This is the last transmission you will receive from this task force until the battle is decided. Requiem. Out. The chamber erupted the moment Yeshel finished reading, delegates rising from their platforms, translators struggling to keep pace with 200 voices talking at once, and in the middle of it all, Admiral Tovek Rel stood absolutely still, staring at the star chart that had automatically appeared on the central display, showing the dead system's location relative to Concord space, close enough now that the reserve fleet gathered along the border could reach it within hours if given the order. "Ambassador," he said, and something in his voice cut through the noise of the chamber enough that delegates nearest to him quieted to listen. "That system is 11 hours from our reserve fleet's position at maximum burn. If the situation is as dire as that message suggests, we could have ships there before the battle concludes." Yeshel looked at him, and then at the frozen image of the star chart, and made the decision without hesitation, the way she had learned, over 11 years of working with humans, that the best decisions in a crisis were rarely the ones you spent a long time deliberating over. "Send them," she said, "not to interfere in a fight they did not ask us to join. Tell the fleet commander explicitly. Their orders are to stand ready at the system's edge, to render aid if requested, and to do absolutely nothing without a direct request from the human command. But get them moving now, because 11 hours from now, whether humanity needs us or not, I want us close enough to matter if they do." Back in the dead system, the Skarn fleet's response to the transmission was immediate and, from a tactical standpoint, exactly what Reyes had been counting on. Skarn command doctrine treated any unexpected enemy transmission as a potential feint, designed to draw attention away from a real threat elsewhere, and their standard response was not caution, but acceleration, a doctrine built on the belief that hesitation in the face of an inferior enemy was itself a weakness to be punished. The Skarn fleet surged forward, screening ships pushing ahead of the main formation to locate and eliminate the source of the broadcast as quickly as possible. Exactly the aggressive, predictable reaction that Threadneedle had been designed to exploit. "They're taking the bait," Okafor reported, watching the Skarn formation begin to fracture into the pattern the plan had predicted. Screening elements are breaking formation to pursue. Assault Corps is slowing to consolidate before advancing further. "Then it's time," Reyes said. "Baptiste, execute. All ships, engage." What followed, over the next several hours, was not a single battle so much as a running series of savage, precise engagements scattered across the debris field of the dead system, exactly the kind of chaotic, unpredictable fighting that Skarn doctrine had never learned to handle well. The Requiem herself led the strike against the fractured screening element, using the dense rocky debris for cover, in a way no Skarn pilot had trained against, striking from angles their sensors struggled to resolve in time, disabling engines and weapons systems with surgical, economical fire, rather than attempting the kind of overwhelming destruction that would have exposed the task force's small numbers. The other 6 ships under Reyes's command executed similar hit-and-fade strikes against isolated elements of the Skarn formation, never engaging more than they could disengage from cleanly, bleeding the larger fleet's cohesion, one small, brutal wound at a time. It was not a clean victory. The corvette Fair Warning, the same ship that had intercepted the Concorde's patient hand weeks earlier, took catastrophic damage in the third hour of fighting, her captain, Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, giving the order to abandon ship with a calm that her crew would speak about for years afterward, ensuring every escape pod launched successfully before she herself remained at her post to guide the crippled vessel into a final, deliberate collision that took 2 Skarn assault ships with it into the dark. The Requiem herself absorbed heavy damage in the 4th hour, a concentrated barrage from the recovering Skarn assault corps tearing through her outer hull and killing 11 crew members in engineering before Baptiste managed to reroute power and stabilize the ship's failing systems. Reyes stood on her damaged bridge, watching the tactical display through intermittent static as her own ship's sensors struggled under the strain of battle damage, and made the calculation every commander in her position eventually had to make, whether the fleet she was bleeding could survive long enough for the plan's final phase to matter, or whether the cost had already grown too high to justify continuing. "Admiral," Baptiste said, his voice tight with the effort of holding the bridge together through the noise and shaking of a ship under sustained fire. "Skarn Assault Corps is regrouping. If they consolidate and push forward in full force, we don't have enough left to stop them from reaching the far side of this system." Reyes looked at the display, at the battered, bleeding shape of her own fleet, still fighting, still holding, and thought about the message she had sent hours earlier, about every human world and colony that had trusted a silence they did not understand, about every soul on the Fair Warning who had bought 2 Skarn ships with their lives, and about the promise she had made to her officers before they had ever entered this system. "Then we make sure they never get the chance," she said, and turned to her weapons officer with the calm, terrible clarity of someone about to spend everything she had left. "Bring us in close. It's time to show them exactly why they call us the Widowmaker." Aboard the UES Bulwark, Captain Hassan Okonkwo watched the tactical display with the particular grim focus of a man who had seen this kind of fight before, and knew exactly how badly it could go. He had been a young ensign during the Skarn incursion, barely out of officer training, serving aboard a cruiser that had not survived its 3rd engagement with the enemy. He had spent the years since carrying the memory of that loss quietly, rarely speaking of it even to close friends, but it had shaped every decision he made as a commanding officer, teaching him a caution and a respect for the Skarn's capabilities that some of the task force's younger captains, who had only read about the incursion in academy textbooks, did not yet fully share. "Helm, bring us around to support the Requiem's flank," he ordered, watching the Bulwark's heavy weapons batteries track toward a cluster of Skarn screening vessels attempting to reform near the edge of the debris field. "Weapons, target their engine sections first. We disable before we destroy. A crippled ship still has to be accounted for by their formation. A destroyed one just gets replaced by the next wave." It was a lesson Okonkwo had learned the hard way 15 years earlier, watching Skarn commanders sacrifice ships without hesitation to maintain the integrity of a formation, treating individual vessel losses as an acceptable cost of continued advance. Disabling a ship, rather than destroying it outright, forced the Skarn formation to either abandon the crippled vessel, weakening their overall cohesion, or divert resources to protect it, slowing their advance and creating exactly the kind of hesitation Threadneedle was designed to exploit. It was a subtler, more patient form of violence than simple destruction, and it required a discipline under fire that not every crew could maintain when the alternative, simply blowing the enemy out of the sky, was so much more immediately satisfying. The Bulwark's gunners held that discipline through 3 consecutive engagements, methodically crippling 6 Skarn vessels without a single confirmed kill, and Okonkwo watched with grim satisfaction as the Skarn formation's cohesion began visibly fraying under the accumulated weight of ships it could neither easily replace nor easily abandon. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that would earn no dramatic mention in any after-action report, but it was exactly the kind of work Threadneedle depended on, and Okonkwo understood, better than most, that the difference between a battle plan that worked and one that collapsed under pressure often came down to captains willing to execute the unglamorous parts precisely, even when a more dramatic choice was sitting right in front of them. Elsewhere in the debris field, aboard the cruiser UES Longwatch, Captain Elena Vasquez faced a crisis of a different kind entirely. A concentrated strike from a Skarn assault vessel had torn through her ship's outer hull in the 2nd hour of fighting, rupturing a coolant line critical to her main reactor and threatening a cascading failure that, left unaddressed, would force her to either eject the reactor core entirely, losing most of her ship's offensive capability at the worst possible moment, or risk a containment breach that could destroy the Long Watch outright. Her chief engineer, a young officer named Tomas Reyes Alvarez, who had no relation to the admiral despite the shared surname, a coincidence that had become something of a running joke aboard the ship, proposed a solution that Vasquez initially rejected as too dangerous, even by the standards of a battle already defined by dangerous choices. Manually rerouting coolant through an auxiliary system never designed for that level of thermal load, a procedure that would require someone to physically remain in the reactor compartment, monitoring the makeshift solution in real time, exposed to radiation levels that exceeded safe limits within minutes. "I can do it, Captain," Reyes Alvarez said over the comm, his voice steady despite what he was proposing. "I know that system better than anyone else aboard. If I stay with it, I can keep it stable long enough to get us through the engagement without losing the reactor." Vasquez hesitated only a moment before answering, understanding, in that moment, the same kind of calculation Admiral Reyes had made when she chose to bring the Requiem directly into the heart of the Skarn formation. "Do it," she said. "But the instant that engagement ends, I want you out of there, and in a medical bay. And that's not a request, Lieutenant. That's an order." Reyes Alvarez held that station for nearly 3 hours, monitoring the jury-rigged coolant system through the worst of the fighting, keeping the Long Watch's reactor stable enough that Vasquez was able to maintain full offensive capability through the engagement's most critical phase. He was carried out of the reactor compartment by his own damage control team the moment the Skarn formation began its retreat, suffering from radiation exposure severe enough that he would spend the following 4 months in intensive medical treatment. But he survived, and the Long Watch survived with him, and Vasquez would later credit his quiet, unglamorous courage as one of the decisive factors that kept her ship in the fight long enough to matter. The 9th hour of battle brought the task force to its most desperate moment, as the surviving Skarn assault corps, battered but still numerically dominant, began to reform into a tighter defensive formation that threatened to overwhelm the exhausted human ships through sheer concentrated firepower, if given the chance to fully consolidate. Reyes, watching this development unfold on the Requiem's damaged bridge, understood that the task force had reached the precise moment Threadneedle's final phase had been built around, the point at which a smaller force, having successfully disrupted a larger enemy's cohesion, either committed fully to finishing what it had started, or risked losing everything gained through hours of hard, costly fighting. "Baptiste," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the intermittent static crackling through the bridge's damaged speaker systems. "Signal the task force. All ships converge on my position. We finish this together, or not at all." It was in the following hour, as the 6 surviving task force ships closed ranks around the badly damaged Requiem and drove one final, coordinated strike into the heart of the reforming Skarn assault corps, that Reyes's earlier decision to close to point-blank range began paying its full dividend. The Skarn formation, already destabilized by hours of disciplined, patient attrition from Okonkwo's methodical crippling strikes, and by the desperate, costly resilience of ships like the Long Watch, found itself unable to bring its full firepower to bear against a human formation that had, through sheer accumulated cost and sacrifice, finally closed the distance the Skarn's own doctrine had never been designed to defend against. It was into this final, chaotic hour of fighting that the Concord Reserve Fleet arrived, exactly as Tovek Rel had promised, sweeping around the flank of the collapsing Skarn formation and cutting off any avenue of coordinated retreat. And it was in the shared, desperate violence of that final hour, human and Concord ships fighting side by side for the first time in over a decade, that the Skarn fleet's long, terrible history of unbroken conquest finally, decisively, came to an end. The Requiem's final maneuver was one that Fleet Command's tactical archives would study for years afterward, taught in academy courses as a case study in what a single, badly damaged ship could still accomplish when its commander understood exactly what she had left to work with, and refused to waste a single piece of it. Reyes ordered the Requiem directly into the heart of the regrouping Skarn assault corps, a move that looked, on any sensor display, like suicide, and that Baptiste, for the only time in 11 years of serving under her, questioned aloud before executing. "Admiral, at that range, their point defense grid alone could finish us in minutes." "I know," Reyes said, That's exactly why they won't expect us to do it. The logic, when Baptiste finally understood it in the seconds before the maneuver began, was as brutal as it was elegant. Skarn assault ships carried devastating offensive weaponry, designed for exactly the kind of overwhelming firepower that had harvested 11 civilizations before humanity. But that firepower was built for engaging targets at range, in the kind of open, predictable formations Skarn doctrine favored. At close range, inside their own minimum engagement envelope, much of that firepower became difficult to bring to bear without risking their own formation. A vulnerability no enemy had ever been reckless enough, or desperate enough, to exploit directly. The Requiem, already battered, already bleeding crew and system integrity, had very little left to lose by closing that distance, and everything to gain if she could survive long enough inside it to do real damage. She survived 19 minutes inside that formation. In those 19 minutes, operating with a skeleton crew, running weapons systems on backup power, routed through Baptiste's increasingly desperate engineering repairs, the Requiem crippled or destroyed 8 Skarn assault vessels at point-blank range, striking engine cores and command sections with the same surgical precision the ship had shown throughout the entire engagement, while the 6 remaining task force ships used the chaos and confusion of the Skarn formation's collapse to strike from the outside, picking off screening vessels that could no longer coordinate a coherent defense. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible performance for 7 ships against a fleet that had outnumbered them 30-1 at the start of the engagement. It was not, in the end, quite enough to win outright. The Skarn fleet, even broken and bleeding, still possessed more than 100 functional vessels when the 9th hour of battle began, and Reyes, watching her own ship's systems fail one by one on a bridge lit only by emergency lighting, understood with the same cold clarity that had guided every decision she'd made in this system, that her task force had reached the limit of what 7 ships could accomplish alone. And then, in the 10th hour, the Concorde Reserve Fleet arrived. They came in from the system's edge exactly as ordered, not charging blindly into the heart of the battle, but sweeping wide around the flank of the remaining Skarn formation, cutting off its avenue of retreat, and forcing a fleet that had never once, in the entire history of its campaigns against 11 civilizations, been caught between 2 coordinated enemy forces at once. Admiral Tovek Rel himself led the strike from the bridge of the Concorde flagship, and in the chaos of the following hour, as the surviving Skarn vessels found themselves trapped between a wounded but still lethal human task force on one side and a fresh, overwhelming Concorde force on the other, something happened that Skarn command doctrine had no protocol for at all. They broke. The remaining Skarn ships, faced for the first time in their species' long and brutal history, with a coordinated response from 2 allied civilizations acting together, abandoned formation entirely, and scattered, individual vessels making desperate, uncoordinated attempts to flee the system, by whatever route offered the least resistance. It was not a retreat, it was a rout, the kind of collapse that happens only when an enemy that has never known real fear finally encounters something it cannot process, and the combined human and Concorde forces, exhausted and battered as they were, pursued only far enough to ensure the Skarn fleet's ability to threaten Earth again in the near future, had been broken beyond any quick recovery. When the last Skarn vessel finally vanished from sensor range, fleeing into the dark beyond the dead system's edge, the silence that followed on the Requiem's bridge was unlike any silence Reyes had experienced in her entire career. Not the tense, waiting silence of the past several months. Something quieter than that. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, almost like relief. "Admiral," Okafor said, his voice hoarse from hours of continuous duty. "Skarn fleet is disengaging across the board. I'm not reading any hostile contacts within sensor range." Reyes closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, allowing herself the smallest possible pause before the enormous work of the aftermath began. "Casualty report," she said quietly. The numbers, when they finally came in over the following hours, were not light. The fair warning was gone entirely, along with her captain and most of her crew. 2 other task force ships had suffered damage severe enough that they would need extensive repair before they could fly again. The Requiem herself had lost 31 crew members across the engagement, a number Reyes would carry with her, silently, for the rest of her life, alongside every other name she had already been carrying since the Skarn incursion 15 years earlier. But the fleet that had come to harvest Earth, the fleet that had believed, exactly as it had believed 15 years earlier, that humanity would be found weak and unprepared, had instead been broken so thoroughly that Fleet Command's analysts would spend the following years debating whether the Skarn possessed the capacity to mount another major offensive against Concord space at all, within the next generation. Ambassador Yeshel Koren stood on the observation deck of the Concord flagship 3 days later, watching through the viewport as the last of the wreckage cleanup crews finished their work in the dead system that history would soon begin calling, in both human and Concord records, the Battle of Threadneedle. Beside her, Admiral Tovek Rel watched the same scene in silence, both of them still absorbing the scale of what had happened in a system that, until a few weeks earlier, had not even possessed a name. "I keep thinking about her message," Yeshel said finally. "Admiral Reyes. We did not forget you. I don't think I understood, until I stood in that chamber and heard it, how much that silence must have cost them to keep. Not just tactically, personally. To let us believe the worst, for months. Because telling us the truth might have cost them everything. That is the thing about humans that I have never fully explained to anyone who did not serve alongside them," Tovek said. "They will absorb almost any cost themselves before they will ask someone else to share the risk of a burden that is rightfully their own. It is not always wise. I have seen it get good officers killed, officers who refused support they genuinely needed, because they judged the risk to others too high. But it is, I think, the truest measure of what they are." He paused, watching a repair crew work carefully around the scarred, battered hull of a ship, visible even at this distance, its silhouette unmistakable despite the damage. The Requiem is still flying. Admiral Reyes refused evacuation to a hospital ship until every wounded member of her crew had been transferred first. Yeshel allowed herself a small, tired smile. "That does not surprise me even slightly." The formal communication that finally reopened full contact between Earth and the Concorde arrived 1 week after the battle, delivered not through any official diplomatic channel, but through a personal message from Fleet Admiral Marcus Whitfield to Ambassador Yeshel Koren directly. An acknowledgement, she understood immediately, of the 11 years of trust she had spent building between their two peoples, trust that had held even through months of terrifying silence. "Ambassador Koren, on behalf of Earth Defense Command and the government of the United Earth Sphere, I want to offer you what should have been offered months ago, and could not be, for reasons I hope you now understand fully. A complete accounting of what we faced, what we did to prepare for it, and the cost it took to see it through. We chose silence because we believed, and still believe, that it gave us the best chance of protecting not only Earth, but every ally who might have been drawn into a fight not yet theirs to share, had the Skarn learned in advance what we were building against them. I know that choice caused you fear, and I know it strained a trust that took years to build. I am asking, now, for the chance to rebuild whatever that silence cost us, and I am asking with the full knowledge that trust, once shaken, is not owed back automatically, simply because the outcome turned out well. It is something we intend to earn again, the same way we earned it the first time. Full communications between our peoples resume as of this message. Every relay, every channel, every open line we closed 3 months ago is being reopened today. And on behalf of every soul we lost keeping this silence, thank you for trusting us anyway, even in the dark, even without knowing why." Yeshel read the message twice on the observation deck, and then, for the first time in the 11 years she had served as humanity's closest ally in the Concord Assembly, she allowed herself to simply stand quietly for a moment and feel the enormous, unfamiliar relief of a crisis finally, truly over. 6 months later, Admiral Sarah Reyes stood in front of a very different audience than the one that had greeted her return to Earth in the immediate aftermath of the battle. She had spent those months in a slow, difficult process of rebuilding her ship, rebuilding her crew roster, around the families of the 31 names she would never stop carrying, and rebuilding, alongside Fleet Admiral Whitfield and Ambassador Koren, the trust between two civilizations that had weathered its hardest test in over 4 decades of friendship. The Kestrel's Requiem sat in dry dock above Earth, her scarred hull freshly repaired, a new nameplate installed beside her old one to mark the battle she had fought in the dead system, that men and women across 2 civilizations now spoke of with quiet respect. Reyes stood at the observation window looking out at her ship, and Ambassador Yeshel Koren, visiting Earth for the first time since the crisis had ended, stood quietly beside her. They still call her the Widowmaker, Yeshel said. Even after everything, I would have thought a story like this one might change what people call her. Reyes allowed herself a small, tired smile. The same kind of smile that had made her almost impossible for other species to read for years. Though Yeshel, after everything they had been through together, thought she was finally beginning to understand it. It's not really about the name, Reyes said. It never was. It's about what the name reminds everyone, ourselves included, that we're capable of when it matters. I'd rather carry a hard reputation and never need it than carry a comfortable one and be wrong when it counts. And if there's a next time? Yeshel asked. Another silence. Another enemy we don't see coming until it's already here? Reyes looked out at her ship, scarred and repaired, and still, unmistakably, exactly what she had always been, and thought about every name on the memorial wall she had visited only once, and about 31 new names that would join the growing list of people humanity would never stop remembering. Then we'll do what we've always done, she said quietly. We'll go dark, we'll do what needs doing, and when it's finished, we'll send one last signal to let the people who trust us know it's over. She looked at Yeshel, and something in her expression, tired and certain all at once, made the ambassador understand, more clearly than any report or briefing ever could, exactly why the rest of the galaxy had learned, over 4 decades, never to underestimate what humanity was willing to become, when everything it loved was on the line. And we'll trust that the people who matter most will still be waiting on the other side of that silence when we do. Far below them, on the surface of a world that had spent 3 months believing itself alone in the dark, city lights burned steadily into the night, unaware and untroubled, exactly the way Sarah Reyes, and every soul who had fought and bled in a nameless system light years away, had always intended them to remain. That, in the end, had been the entire point of the silence. Not fear, not weakness, not surrender, but a promise, kept at enormous cost, that whatever darkness came for Earth would always find something waiting for it in the dark to answer back. The formal memorial service for the 31 crew members lost aboard the Requiem, and for Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand and the crew of the Fair Warning, took place on a quiet, overcast morning at the same memorial wall Reyes had visited only once in the years since the Skarn incursion. This time she did not come alone. She stood at the front of a gathered crowd that included not only the families of the fallen, but a formal Concord delegation, led personally by Ambassador Yeshel Koren and Admiral Tovek Rel, an unprecedented gesture of solidarity that the Concord had never before extended to a purely human memorial service. Reyes read each of the 32 names aloud herself, refusing the offer of a ceremonial reader, because she believed, and had told Whitfield privately beforehand, that the names deserved to be spoken by someone who had watched every one of those people work, fight, and ultimately give everything they had during the battle in the dead system. Her voice did not break during the reading, though several observers noted, afterward, the visible effort it cost her to keep it steady. Afterward, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Tovek approached her quietly, standing beside her at the base of the memorial wall, in a silence that needed no translation between their two very different species. I lost people in this war too, he said finally, 15 years ago, and again in that dead system a week ago. I do not think the weight of it ever fully leaves you. I have simply learned, over many years, to carry it alongside everything else. Does it get easier? Reyes asked, surprising herself with the honesty of the question. Tovek considered this carefully before answering, the way he considered most things that mattered. No, he said. But it becomes, I think, a kind of company. A reminder of exactly what the fighting was for, and exactly who you owe the effort of making sure it was worth something. He looked at the long list of names carved into the wall behind them, human names stretching back decades, a record of every conflict humanity had fought since first venturing beyond its own solar system. I do not think that is a burden either of our species can escape, Admiral. I think it is simply the price that comes with being the kind of people willing to stand between danger and everyone else. I have found, over time, that it is a price worth paying, however heavy it remains. Reyes said nothing for a long moment, simply standing beside him in the quiet morning air, and then, finally, she nodded, a small, tired gesture that carried more weight than words could have managed. In the months following the Battle of Threadneedle, the relationship between Earth and the Concord did not simply return to what it had been before the crisis. It deepened, tempered by shared sacrifice, into something sturdier than the cautious cooperative friendship the two civilizations had built over the preceding decades. Joint military exercises, informally proposed by Tovek Rel during one of his frequent visits to Earth, became a regular fixture over the following years, ensuring that human and Concord forces would never again find themselves fighting side by side, for the first time only in the desperate final hour of an actual battle. Trade agreements were renegotiated not to humanity's advantage alone, as some delegates had once feared, but in a spirit of genuine mutual benefit that reflected the trust rebuilt through crisis. Ambassador Yeshel Koren was awarded, in a ceremony held jointly on Earth and within the Concord Assembly Chamber, an honor that had never before been created. A formal title recognizing her as the first Concord official to hold dual citizenship in both the Concord and the United Earth Sphere, a largely symbolic gesture, but one that carried enormous weight, given everything she had done, quietly and persistently, to hold the alliance together through months of fear and uncertainty. She accepted the honor with characteristic humility, telling the assembled crowd that the true credit belonged not to any single diplomat, but to every ordinary person, human and Concord alike, who had chosen to trust an ally through a silence they did not understand, simply because that trust had been earned, patiently, over many years, long before the crisis ever began. Devon Okafor, promoted to full lieutenant commander in recognition of his role in first detecting the Skarn reconnaissance signature that had given Earth Defense Command the crucial months of warning it needed to prepare, remained aboard the Requiem under Reyes's continued command, his obsessive, careful attention to sensor data, now formally recognized as one of the most valuable skills in the entire fleet. He kept, in his personal quarters, a small photograph of his sister, the same one he had carried since joining the fleet years earlier, and told anyone who asked that he still thought of her every time a sensor anomaly crossed his display, a promise kept, in its own quiet way, through every threat he helped the fleet detect in time. Captain Idris Baptiste was given command of his own vessel 8 months after the battle, a promotion he had earned many times over through years of steady, capable service, though he told Reyes privately, on the night before his transfer, that no future command would ever quite replace what it had meant to serve as her second-in-command through the hardest fight of both their careers. Reyes, in turn, told him something she rarely said aloud to anyone, that she considered him one of the finest officers she had ever served beside, and that the fleet, and Earth itself, was safer for having him commanding a ship of his own. 2 years after the Battle of Threadneedle, Sarah Reyes stood once more on the Requiem's bridge, older now, the silver threading further through her dark hair, watching a new generation of officers, some of them barely out of academy training, take up the stations once held by people whose names were now carved permanently into a memorial wall on Earth. The galaxy had changed in the years since the battle, subtly but unmistakably. Skarn incursions along the Concord's outer border had all but ceased entirely, the harvesting fleets that had once terrorized a dozen civilizations seemingly unwilling, or unable, to mount another major offensive after the losses suffered in the Dead System. Human-Concord relations had reached a level of cooperation and mutual trust that would have seemed unimaginable to the cautious, careful diplomats who had first negotiated contact between the two civilizations decades earlier. And the Requiem herself, scarred but unbroken, remained exactly what she had always been, humanity's answer to the darkness, ready, should it ever come calling again, to vanish quietly into the silence, and to send, when the moment finally demanded it, one final signal that the entire galaxy would remember. Somewhere out past the edge of Concord space, in the deep quiet between the stars, that promise held,